The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Morning, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. My name's Tom Millichamp. We're just there's a few people still arriving, so we'll just hang on for another couple of minutes and just make sure everyone has arrived, and then we'll start. So as I say, we'll just give it a few more minutes. Okay, morning everybody. We'll get started now. Might have a few more join as we go through the introductions. I just want to check that first of all you can hear me, and secondly that you can see my screen. So if anyone can just type into the chat, that would be great. Just to let me know that you can hear me okay. Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so good morning everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar. This is the first webinar of 2 sessions we're doing on this topic, which is test automation with UFT and Octane, ALM Octane. My name is Tom Millichamp. I also have one of my colleagues, Steve Powell, as well. We are both from Edgewords. And we also have Steve Brooker with us from EOH, who will be having a chat later on in the webinar as well. Okay, so this webinar is about automated testing as part of the continuous integration, continuous delivery process. So the central application to this is Microfocus's ALM Octane. And we're going to be looking at how we can integrate UFT, source control, and continuous integration tools, in this case Jenkins, integrating the tools, creating a joined up automated testing process as part of continuous integration. So the demo stack we're going to be using for the webinar is Octane, Jenkins, Git, GitHub, and UFT. The version of UFT I've got installed for this demo is 14.51. 14.53 has just been released, and I noticed there are some extra support for some of the tools that we're using today, so things like Tortoise Git. So I'll have a talk about that when we look at source control. Okay, a couple of notes to start then. Feel free to ask questions. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. If I could ask you all to stay muted, just so we don't have any background noise, that would be great. As I say, questions, if you just type them into the question box or into the chat box, we can have a look at those at the end of the webinar. The session is being recorded, so we will, for anyone that's registered on the webinar, we'll send out the links to the recording later on today as well. Okay, so this is part one of 2 sessions. Today we are going to be looking at integrating UFT, so Microfocus's test automation tool, with source control. UFT actually integrates with either Subversion, SVN, or Git, but through this demo we will be using Git just because it's the more popular source control tool. We will also be looking at GitHub and some of the advantages of using a centralized repository, cloud-based repositories like GitHub. So today it's going to be integrating UFT with source control. And then next Wednesday, same time, will be the second part of this webinar, which we will then be introducing our continuous integration tool, Jenkins in this case, and ALM Octane. So we will look at how we can then integrate all of the tools to look at delivering continuous integration automated testing. Again, that session will be recorded, so if you can't make next week's session, don't worry. As long as you've registered for this one, you will get the link to the recording for that session as well. Okay, so this is just a quick introduction to the architecture that we're looking at, this continuous integration process. As I say, we're going to be looking at a small part of this today, or the first part, but this gives you an idea of the overall architecture. So all of this is going to be revolving around ALM Octane. So ALM Octane is our development management tool, and we are going to look at how we can use Octane to store our automated UFT tests and to execute them. Now, the execution of automated tests through ALM Octane is done by continuous integration tools, so Bamboo, TeamCity, Jenkins, TFS, etc. So we're going to be using Jenkins. So in next week's webinar, we're going to be looking at how we integrate Jenkins with Octane and then use that to execute our automated tests, our UFT tests. Now, the way we are going to work is we are going to integrate UFT with Git to begin with. So we're going to be creating our automated test suite using UFT, and we are going to be storing that test suite in a Git repository. So then next week, we're going to look at how we can get Jenkins and Octane to talk to that Git repository and to pull tests from it and execute tests through Jenkins and then push the results back to ALM Octane. So this is the entire architecture. This is the integration that we're going to be looking at, and we'll have this working by the end of next week's session. So today we are looking at the section on the right, which is UFT and Git. So getting our automation, our test suite, into a Git repository. Okay, so just quickly mention what I'm going to be using on today's demo. I've got UFT 14.51 installed. I also have Git installed. So Git is an open source source control tool. So that has just been downloaded and installed locally on this machine. And I have also installed Tortoise Git. Tortoise Git actually just gives us a graphical interface to Git. So it sits on top of Git and gives us a nice graphical UI interface for our source control, where Git itself is actually just command line driven. Okay, so let's actually look at the first part of this, which is adding UFT project to a local Git repository. Okay, regardless, so something I just want to mention here is regardless of whether you are, what automation tool you are using, or whether you're using Octane or not, using source control is a really important part of the automated testing process. Because typically we are not going to have one person writing automated tests. We're going to have a team of automated test engineers. And they will be sharing resources. They will be adding tests, editing tests from the same test suite. So we have to be very protective about them overwriting other people's work, causing issues to other people's automated tests. So to control that, just like developers would, automated test engineers really need to invest in some kind of source control management. A number of tools out there. We're looking at UFT today. UFT supports Subversion and Git. Git tends to be the most popular, so that's what we're looking at here. Okay, so I've got UFT open here, and I'm going to be working just in a local directory structure to start with. So this is just in my documents on this local machine. And in here, I've got my UFT folder. In here, I've got a project. So this is just a folder, say just a directory structure at the moment, UFT SPTM. In here, I've got folders as you would for any UFT project that you're storing locally for things like your function libraries, your shared repositories, test data, your actual test scripts. You might have one for your results, etc. So we've got a standard folder structure that we would use for UFT. If we look in here, I've got just a single test at the moment, add to cart, so I've already created a test. We'll open that in a moment. And we also have a shared repository. None of this is under source control at the moment. So literally all I've done is open UFT, created a test, and stored it in this directory structure. So let's just open that test, which is here, add to cart, the one you've just seen. Okay, so here's my test. Here's my shared object repository. And it's just a simple test with a single action just for this demo. So here we can see our test automation. And this was literally just record and replay. So the only extra thing I've done is created a shared repository here. So let's just execute that. And you can see that run. So there we go. It's a web test, as you can see, and just opens up Chrome in this case to a demo online shopping site. Purchases an item, validates that the item is in the cart, and then completes. So we can see that executes fine. Okay, so pretty standard there. We've just got a single test in a local directory structure here. So the first point of this is that I want to nominate this local UFT automated testing project as a Git repository. So remember, I've got Git installed and I've got Tortoise Git installed on here. So if I just go into this directory structure and do a right click, we can see that because I've got Git installed, I've got access to my Git menu items, and here I've got Git create a repository here. So all I'm going to do is nominate this directory as a Git repository. I don't want to check this. If I check this box, it's going to empty this out, but we've already got some we've already got some tests and folders in here. So I'm going to leave that unchecked and click OK. And we can see it's initialized this Git repository. And here's my Git folder structure. Okay, now I have closed UFT because UFT sometimes caches the information. So if we actually open UFT again and open that test, it will now recognize that that is a Git repository. So anything under there, our shared repositories, our automated tests, will now be under source control. Okay, so we have a visual cue to show us that it's recognized that this is a Git repository. Over on the left-hand side, you can see we now have these exclamation marks. And that's because these are new files that have been added to the Git repository, but haven't yet been committed. So we haven't said, yet that's fine, we finished working on those. We are going to commit those as a particular version. So let's just do that now, and then we'll make some changes. So we do that within UFT at the test level. So I can select a test, right click, and because it recognizes that this test is under source control, you can see that we've got Git commands. We've got our pull, commit, revert, push, create branch, switch branches, merge branches. So I'm just going to do a commit to begin with. It's just letting me know that this test is using external files, because remember, we're using a shared object repository here. So it's just saying we would also need to check in the shared repository if we finish working with that, or do that separately anyway. So let's just call this first commit. And we've committed the test, and we can see we've now got the green ticks to show that that is the latest version synchronized with the Git repository. So let's do the same again with the shared object repository as well. So now everything has been committed. So now my UFT project is under source control. So any new tests I create will be the same. We'll have the exclamation mark. We can work on them in the working directory, and then when we're finished, we can create a commit and commit them into source control. But this is all local at the moment. This is all just on my machine. So in a little while, we'll look at how we can start sharing this with other team members. Before I do that, let's just look at some of these options in here. So let's make a change and see what that looks like. So if I add a statement in here, okay, and we shall save that. Now, because we've made a change, straight away over on the left-hand side, we can see that this test has changed, and we've got the information there to show it. So if I do a right click on here, on the action rather, here we go. So here's the action that's changed, and we could do a compare with previous version, and there we go. We can see our current, or the existing, the current committed version and our local version over on the right hand side. So we can see what's been modified within the file. The diff tool in UFT that you're looking at here is quite useful, because this also allows us to look at the differences in versions for object repositories as well. And object repositories are binary files. So if I go into here and I do a right click, in fact, let's go into tests. There we go. So here's my script. We do have a diff tool within Git as well, or within Tortoise Git. You can see we've got diff with previous version. Now, we wouldn't be able to use that on an object repository, because an object repository is a binary file. So as opposed to using Tortoise Git for that, we can use the diff tool that's built into UFT. So it has got some good advantages there. If I'm happy with those changes, again, I can just right click and I can commit those changes. And we're now back in sync. Okay, now at the moment, I'm just doing this locally. So I could be adding tests, editing tests. I can commit those changes when I'm happy with those. I can revert to previous versions. I can look at the differences between versions. I can manage that through UFT, as we've seen here with our Git commands, or I could even do that just directly through Git and Tortoise Git within the directory structure. However, at the moment, I am purely working locally, so everything is on this machine. So what we want to do as part of this webinar is introduce you to GitHub. So within UFT, as I say, it supports Git and Subversion. For Git, anything, and the same with ALM Octane, anything Git is supported. So Git itself, if you've got your own Git server, or you're using GitLab, or you're using GitHub, these are all supported under ALM Octane, and we could do what I'm doing today with any of those exactly the same. Okay, so I'm going to use GitHub as part of this demo, and we'll look in the second webinar next week how we can integrate GitHub then into ALM Octane as well. So GitHub is a cloud service for Git repositories, but it has a lot of extra tools in there which we'll have a chat about in a bit when we have a look at it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an empty repository on GitHub in the cloud. And then what I'm going to do is I am going to push my local Git repository up to GitHub. So it will then be in the cloud, and we can synchronize between my local Git repository and the GitHub in the cloud repository, but it will then be access to my other automation team members. So all of them can view, pull changes, make changes, and contribute to UFT automated test suite in the cloud. Okay, so let's have a look at that. So I'm just going to open up a web browser, and I'm going to go to the Edgewords GitHub account, which is here. And I'm going to create an empty GitHub repository. So at the top here, I'm going to create a new repository, and I'm going to give this a name. Let's give it the same name as my UFT project. I'm not going to initialize the repository yet because I'm actually just going to push my local Git repository up to here. So that's all I'm doing, creating a new repository, giving it a unique name, and create the repository. GitHub then provides a URL. So the URLs are nice and simple, github.com, your account name, and then whatever you've called the repository. So I'm just going to copy that URL, and I'll minimize that for the time being. Okay, now this step we actually do need to do just using Git. So I am just going to go into project, which is here. Here's my local Git repository. So what I'm going to do is just right click here, and I'm going to use the Git GUI to do this. You could do this via, if you're used to Git and used to using Git through the command line, then obviously you could do this quite simply through the command prompt. But here I'm just going to do it visually, keep it simple. So I'm going to do a Git GUI here, click on remote, and I'm going to add a remote repository. So essentially what I'm doing is we've got this local Git repository, and I'm going to tell it about my GitHub repository in the cloud and say, look, there's a remote repository that I want to be able to pull and push my changes from. So I just click add. We can give this a name, put in the location, which is just that URL we just copied. And for the time being, I'm not going to do anything else. I'm literally just going to tell it about this remote repository, this GitHub repository, and click add. Okay, I think what I'll do is I'll just quickly close UFT, as I say, just to make sure it's not caching anything. Open that Git repository through UFT again, just so it definitely knows about that we've updated it with that remote GitHub repository. So let's open our test again. Okay, that's great. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to right click and I'm going to do a git push. So remember, this is the local test in the local repository here, but I've told the Git repository about our remote GitHub in the cloud repository. So what I'm going to do is do this through UFT. You could either do it through the directory structure using Git, Tortoise Git, or we can do it directly through UFT, and we can do a git push, and we can push this up to the cloud, up to our GitHub repository. Okay, so hopefully that was successful. Be easy to tell if I go back into GitHub and do a refresh. There we go. So you can see the files have come up to here. Here's the add to cart with our actions. And also, because it's making use of a shared object repository, so this test is reliant on external files within that repository, UFT has been intelligent enough to also push the repositories up as well. So we have now pushed our local Git repository, UFT test suite, which is locally on the machine in the local Git repository, up to GitHub. So this is now available to the rest of my test team. Okay, so to make this, try and make this a bit more sort of real world, I've got my colleague Steve Powell, and I'm going to make him the presenter. In fact, what I will do just before I do that is I'm going to add Steve as a collaborator for this project. So I'm going to go in this GitHub project, I'm going to go to the settings and I'm going to click on collaborators. Oh, just loading in again. Okay, and I know Steve's username, so I'm just going to add Steve as a collaborator. So within GitHub, you can create an organization. Within an organization, you can set up teams, add members to work on those projects. So that's what I've done here. I've added Steve, my colleague, as a collaborator to this GitHub project. So he can make changes, push his changes directly up to here. He will now get a notification. So he will get an email saying he's been added to this project. So he can now log into this GitHub repository and we can work on this together. I'll talk about branching. Well, you'll see some of this as we go through. At the moment, we just have a single branch that you can see here, which is the master. So all I'm doing is using a single branch, just the master, and I am making changes, so pulling changes directly to the master at the moment. So we'll talk about branching in a few moments, but what I'll do is I will just pass control over to Steve.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me. And hopefully on my screen you can see my email client. And Tom a few moments ago made me a collaborator on this GitHub repository. And we have an email from GitHub here with view invitation. I'm going to give that. And Edwards has invited me to collaborate on this particular repository, so I shall accept that invitation. And I'm taken to the repository page, where from the little green button here, I can select clone or download this particular repository. I'm actually going to switch into my virtual machine where I've already got UFT open. And I think I've got Chrome open on this page as well. Repository really old to clone. So let's hit the green button, copy this URL. into my documents folder. Just like Tom, I've got tortoise Git and Git installed prior to start. And down the bottom, we have the ability to clone this repository. So we'll do a git clone. The URL that I copied earlier has been recognized on my system clipboard and pasted in ready for me. And after a few seconds, that code should be copied from the GitHub repository down to my local system. Let's go in and have a look. Here we are. The eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed that I don't have as many folders as Tom had earlier. This is simply because if a folder doesn't have a file inside of it, Git won't copy that folder up to the system. So if Tom or myself were later to create these folders, add some files to them, and then push those changes, they would be synchronized. Right, let's open this test and check that it works. So here we are. Oops. Try again. Inside the test folder, we've got Tom's add to cart test. It looks like Tom had a couple of extra plugins loaded on his installation when he created this test, the Silverlight and WPF plugin. I happen to know this is a web test in advance, so we should be able to still run this without issue. Otherwise, I'd need to quit out a UFT relaunch and select the Silverlight and WPF plugins as well. All right. Looking in the Solution Explorer on the left-hand side, we get the similar icons, similar badges across the test, indicating that add to cart is under version control and is the latest version. Action 1, likewise, local also. Shared object repositories coming with a little blue badge indicating there's a slight problem. It can't find the shared object repository. For whatever reason, this happens sometimes. To fix the problem, I'll simply right-click in the errors dialog down the bottom, go to locate missing resource, and find a shared object repository, which I'm certain was copied down. Here it is. Again, this isn't something we do all the time. In fact, and in our experience, once you've fixed it once, it seems to work for all members in all collaborators of this GitHub repository. Heading into action 1, I have the individual steps here. So let's give this a play, check that it works. Just fine. All but with a slight warning because I don't have all of the add-ins loaded that Tom had earlier when he created the test. But the test itself is executed through just okay. So at this stage, I could, just as Tom was doing earlier, make changes to this particular test and commit them back. Because I do have commit access to the master branch, I could commit directly in there. But instead, what I'm going to try and do is create a new test and create that new test on a new branch. This will give us the ability for me afterwards to create what's called a pull request. So I can notify Tom that I've created a new test. Tom can then look at that test and decide if he wants to pull it into master. If he discovers issues with the test, he might send me issue notifications, file some issues saying that there are other changes that I'd need to make to my test before he's willing to commit to master. So again, this is all about the process of not trampling on each other's toes, causing problems, causing issues in a large shared project. Right, so let's create a new branch. I'm going to right-click in the Solution Explorer here, and we've got Git Create Branch. So what shall I call this? New test branch. I'm going to base this on the master branch, and I'm going to switch to the new branch at the same time. Again, we're going to So far, so good. Let's close. Let's create a new test. See where it's going to be placed. See user Edwards documents, UFT SPTM tests. That looks like the correct place. And I'll call this a navigation test. I think something else I'll do is I'll try and make use of the shared object repository since it's already been created. So let's associate object repository with my action. Here it is. I'm given the option of using absolute or relative paths. Generally, I will want to use a relative path because we could be moving these tests around. In fact, we're certainly going to be moving these tests around between different systems. So if resources can be found relative to the location of the test, it's going to be much more robust. If we use an absolute path, all of our systems would have to be set up with, for example, the same Windows username, and all the tests would have to be stored in the same location. That's likely to be the case in a distributed project such as this. Looking at the Solution Explorer on the left-hand side here, interesting to note the shared object repository has a green badge at the moment indicating that it is the latest version. The test itself, the action itself, and the local repository associated with the action has a red badge indicating that it's not the latest revision. Of course, that's not surprising. I haven't yet committed these changes to either my local Git repository or upstream. So inside of action 1, I'm just going to hit record. Up the following when recording on running. Yeah, this is the address I want to go to, and we want to use Google Chrome. Right, we're recording our test. We have a recording toolbar at the top here, and that's being recorded. Let's just go, and I'll stop recording. Take off all of that, run to check that it works. Go to assist. Basically did what I did. So it looks good. All right, my first step at this stage might be to commit this to my local repository, and following that, I might want to push it up. So let's right-click on the test itself. We can do a git commit. Again, we have a little warning that this test is making use of external files. The external file it's talking about is the shared object repository. I'll create a quick commit, git commit message, my commit of this particular test. And then we'll right-click again and git push. So Git system will push all committed changes from the current repository upstream to my new branch. Okay, that appears to have happened. So We'll switch back to Chrome. And we can see that a new test branch has been created. We have somewhere along the top here, notification branches. We can see branches have been created. My new test branch just updated. Coming back, switch between which branches are available as well. So this is the branch which at the moment well, I can switch to have a look at notify Tom that I've created this branch and I'd like him to pull in and merge in this code to the master line. So over here we've got compare and create a pull request. Having a review my new test and pull to master. Create that. I'll pull request in a moment. Yeah. Any request because to merge, so it may be back and forth the test.
Right, I do apologise for the sound. I've noticed the sound is dropping in and out a little bit there. Steve, just let me know if my sound drops out and I need to repeat anything. Okay, so I'll just sort of refresh your minds on what Steve has just done. So first of all, what we're doing is we're using GitHub really as our main repository. So the GitHub repository that we created in the cloud is going to be our UFT test suite that multiple testers are going to be working on. So multiple testers, in this case myself and Steve, are working locally, adding tests, amending tests, and pushing those changes up to our GitHub repository. So our GitHub repository is our sort of master repository, our UFT test suite. So the advantage of this is that obviously it's cloud-based. So it doesn't matter if we're in separate geographies, we are working on the same project. If we are doing home working, people are working from home a couple of days a week, no problem, because they have access to the UFT test suite as well because it's in the cloud. GitHub has got collaboration tools, which we'll have a look at in a moment. So as a member of the automated test team, all of the test engineers can collaborate with each other, have online conversations, raise issues, make comments on the code. We can also synchronize GitHub repositories with Octane. So we can get Octane to automatically discover our UFT tests and add them into Octane. And then we can use our CI tool to also pull the UFT tests from GitHub, from our GitHub repository, and execute them as well. So we can do things like parallel execution, which we'll have a look at. GitHub is nice and easy. It's web-based. It's a very easy to use interface. So for those of you who are new to source control, just to explain what Steve's just done. So originally I created this GitHub repository for our UFT test suite, and that was on the master branch. So think of that as, that is our project, our main project. Now, sometimes we don't want people making changes directly to that project. So what we can do is get them to work in a branch, just as Steve has done. So he creates a new branch, he will add tests, amend tests, work in that branch, and then raise what's called a pull request to say, right, I've made some changes, but I haven't made them directly to your project. I've made them in this separate side branch. review those, and if you're happy with them, we can then merge them into the main project. So again, this is all about working, if you're working in reasonable sized teams, in bigger teams, as opposed to you editing, adding directly to your UFT project. You can get people to work in branches, you can review those changes, and if you're happy with them and there are no conflicts, you can then merge them into your main project. So that's what Steve has just done there. So if I now go into the GitHub project, which is here, I can see that there are 2 branches. I can see that there is a pull request. And again, I could have email notifications of this. We could also apply rules to this. So things like the tests have to be executed and passed before they can be merged. If I look at the new pull request, which is here, so this is for this new test branch that Steve created, I can come in here and I can see, so GitHub automatically tells me there are no conflicts. So merging can be performed without any issues in here. I can make comments to this. If I go to the top, I can also see the files. So I can see, okay, what files has he created here? So I can have a look and it'll show me all the files. And for these files, such as the test, which is here, I can even add comments directly against line of code. So if I think that something needs changing, I could raise that as an issue, or I could send a notification to Steve, or I can even start a review or comments directly at the source code. So directly at the line of code that I think he should amend or change. So again, all about collaboration. So we'll talk about some of those in a moment, but let's just go back to that now, because we need to keep this within the hour if possible. So I'm quite happy with that. So I can just hit merge, and I can merge Steve's changes into the master branch. So that's worked successfully. At this point, we could tidy up, we could delete the branch, or Steve could delete his branch when he's finished with it. So now if I go back to the code and we look in tests, we can see we've got my original test and we've got Steve's test in there as well, all now on the master branch. So I've had a look at the changes Steve wanted to make. I can see that there are no conflicts, so I've merged those into the main UFT automation project, if you like. Okay, and as a test engineer, I could then pull those changes down to my local repository. So here's my local UFT. At the moment, I've just got add to cart, but now I can right click and using Tortoise Git in this case, or you could do it through the command line just using Git, I can do a pull, choose the remote and the master branch, click OK, and pull any of those changes down locally. So I can then run the tests and work on those differently locally if I want. So here we go, there's Steve's test, which I can now open in UFT, execute, make changes, push those changes back if I want. Okay, I'll come back to the collaboration tools in just a second, and we'll talk about some of those. But may look a bit complicated to begin with, but once it's set up, it's pretty straightforward. So the GitHub workflow is the fact that, I come in the morning, going to be working on my UFT test automation project. So what I would first of all do is do a pull any of or the most recent changes from the GitHub remote repository. Then create a branch if I'm working in a big team. If there's only a couple of you, you could just work directly on the master. But if you're working in, if there's sort of 3 or 4 of you working on the same UFT test suite, then what I'd recommend is we create a branch. make changes, add tests, do whatever work you need to do. When you're happy with those, you commit them locally and then push them back up to GitHub and raise a pull request for them to be merged into the master branch. And then when I finish with that branch, I can always tidy up and delete that branch if I want. And that's the workflow that we would all do, and that makes sure that there's no way that we're going to have conflicts or overwrite each other's work, and making sure that we always have the latest changes. So something else I just want to mention about GitHub, Git's the most popular source control tool out there. It's open source. So GitHub allows us to have repositories in the cloud. So this is actually a commercial offering, but it has some great tools. So we can set up an organization within GitHub account. We can set up teams in there. We can set up members, and members can have different roles and permissions. In there, we can set up a wiki page for our automation project, or a number of wiki pages if we want. We can also set up project boards. So project boards allow us to see issues, pull requests, and any notes as cards. In fact, you can see that down here on the screenshot, and we can change the columns to whatever we want, or we can set up our own columns, so to do, in progress, completed. So we can manage, within a larger team, we can manage issues, pull requests, any notes that we raise ourselves as well, directly in there, or tasks that we need to perform. We also have an issue tracker, and issues can be linked directly to code. So we can raise issues and say, we've got a problem with this test. Can somebody sort this out or write a function to do something? So we've got those collaboration tools there. We can also set up emails and notifications. So, if an issue is assigned to me, I can get an automatic email to say somebody's raised an issue. I need to manage that. So the great thing about GitHub is obviously it's in the cloud, it's secure, it's backed up, but we've got these collaboration tools. So if I just go back into GitHub, into this GitHub project, then we can see that in here. So this is my project that we've just been looking at, which has my tests in. This is my UFT project we've been working on. Click on this tab and we've got issues. So at any point in here, we can raise issues. And these don't have to be problems. These could be ideas, suggestions, whatever you like. Okay, and I could assign this to somebody. So let's assign this to Steve. And I could also, if I wanted to, add labels to this, or I could, if I wanted to, also assign this to a project. So we'll have a look at project boards in just a moment. So submit a new issue. Okay, and Steve will now get an email about that. So we can use this very much as I say, collaboration tool, documentation. If we go to projects, show you what a project board looks like on here. So here we can create a project, and the type of project board we can create our own and set up our own columns, or we can actually use some of these templates in here. So for example, we can have automated Kanban style, which is quite nice. So this will give us our to do in progress done, and it will automatically add any issues, pull requests to the board, and it will automatically close them when they are closed as well. So let's just create a quick project. So here's my project board. So for this UFT automation project, I've got a project board. In here, at any point, we can add notes. Okay, and these notes or cards can be just dragged and dropped like you would any kind of agile board, really. And if we go to issues, because this is automated, if I create an issue, we can actually assign this to a project board. So there's the project board I just created, and I could submit that, and then it will be automatically added to our project board. Here it is, new issue, and if somebody drags this to done, it will automatically close it, or if they close it, it will automatically reflect that in this board because we've got the automation on it. So again, this is just a way of tracking pull requests, issues, adding notes as cards, and giving us a board that we can manage our workload in a team. And then finally, we've got wiki here as well, so we can create a wiki page as you would normally, embed images, hypertext links, etc. So if we want to advertise or tell people about our UFT test automation project, we can do that in here. Okay, so just conscious of time. So what we've looked at today is how we can integrate Microfocus's UFT with Git and also with GitHub. We've looked at some of the advantages of using GitHub, which is the fact that it's cloud-based, secure, we can set up organizations, teams, team members, and we've got collaboration tools, really great collaboration tools built in a very easy to use interface. So this is the first step towards our continuous integration setup. So in the second webinar next week, same time, we're then going to look at how we can synchronize our GitHub UFT project with Octane. So we can get Octane to automatically discover the UFT tests within our GitHub project and add them into Octane. And then we're going to look at how we can execute individual tests or test suites directly from Octane. And then finally, we'll look at Jenkins. So we'll look at using a continuous integration tool, setting up a Jenkins job to execute our UFT tests. And those tests can also, if they're web or mobile, be executed in parallel. So we'll have a look at that as well. So that is in the second part of the webinar. So just to mention who we are, Edgewords, we provide training courses. So if you're interested in UFT, we provide a number of UFT training courses. We also provide courses in Microfocus's new ALM Octane. So we've got a 2-day course on using Octane. And also if you're doing Lean FT or UFT Pro as it's called now, then we can provide you with training on that as well. We also do training in things like BDD, Cucumber, SpecFlow, etc. I'm just going to pass you over to Steve Brooker, because if you're interested in GitHub, then you may want to look at GitHub Enterprise. So I'll just pass you over to Steve Brooker now, and he can just talk about some of those services with you.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Yeah, I'm just going to go over this very briefly. Some of you may be aware there are different versions of GitHub available. Tom has mentioned that it is available as an open source solution, but quite importantly, for some of the organizations you work for, it's also available as an enterprise solution. So on the slide there, you can see some of the advantages of using the enterprise version. So that's available on-prem and in the cloud, or a combination of both. So if you'd like to talk to us more about GitHub, then please get in touch. I think it's also worth pointing out that there's nothing wrong with having a specific GitHub repository for your automation. So that could be separate to your actual code, application code. There's nothing, because I know some organizations, the application code is completely separate and may be provided by third parties. So there's nothing wrong with exploring that. Thanks, Tom. And yeah, just to finish off, Thomas mentioned he's from Edgewords. I'm from EOH, very large organisation based in South Africa. We're part of the UK arm of that. I think I won't go through all of these points on the slide, but I just want to emphasize we are different. We do provide Microfocus products, but we also provide other elements of the DevOps or the automation tool chain. So we do provide GitHub solutions, and we do provide enterprise Jenkins solutions and other automated test solutions. And we have a very wide range of services that we can provide around those. Thomas mentioned the training services, the enablement. We can set up demonstration environments. We can provide implementation services. We can host. There's a very wide range of services. So if you have any interest in those, again, please contact me. So I'll pass back to Tom, but just to say, I know we've got some more of these webinars lined up in the future. If you have any suggestions on things that you'd like to cover, then please, again, get in touch with us. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So yeah, thanks again, everyone, for attending. Any questions, you can email Steve Brooker, who's just chatting then. As I say, suggestions on webinars are welcome as well. A couple of links there for some of what we've covered today, really: UFT and source control, GitHub help, Octane help, and Octane integration, so what you can integrate Octane with, which we will talk about in the next webinar. So this was part one. If you've registered for this, you'll automatically be registered for next week's session as well. Both of them are being recorded, so the follow-up for this, I will send out a link to the recording of today's session, and the same for next week to anyone that's registered. If you have any questions in the meantime, then feel free to ask, and we can also include sort of Q&As within the email I send out. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.